He was accused of defying the court, then ridiculed in front of Silicon Valley's elite. But within minutes, Elon Musk flipped the script and took down the very man wearing the robe. Elon Musk didn't come to play nice. The marble floors of the federal courthouse in San Francisco echoed with the weight of what was about to happen. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop the hallway from filling with reporters, eyes wide, microphones in hand. Everyone knew this hearing would be tense. No one expected it to go nuclear. Inside Courtroom 7B, Judge James Boasberg sat perched above the room, his expression unreadable. He had made his position clear a week ago. Tesla's AI data collection practices were halted, at least until further judicial review. But the company had moved forward anyway. Server logs confirmed it. Thousands of driving videos, user interactions, and voice commands were still being harvested despite the court order. Elon Musk, tech billionaire and known for never backing down, stood at the defense table in a tailored black suit that looked like it had been worn through battles. His tie was absent, his jaw clenched. He looked Boasberg square in the eye. "Your Honor," Musk began, voice steady but sharp. "Tesla acted within the scope of our user agreements and privacy policies. You may not like our interpretation, but that doesn't make it illegal." Judge Boasberg leaned forward. "Mr. Musk, this court issued a temporary restraining order. You ignored it." "No, sir," Musk replied. "We responded to a technological necessity. We used legal authority. What we didn't do is wait for permission from a bench that's been swayed by politics more than technological understanding." Gasps erupted from the gallery. A court bailiff straightened in his seat. Boasberg's eye twitched, barely, but enough. "You're accusing this court of bias?" Boasberg asked, his voice low. "I'm saying the law should stand on its own," Musk said, then paused. "Without influence from tech competitors feeding you arguments behind closed doors." There it was. The needle twisted deeper. That last line wasn't rhetorical. It was personal, and Boasberg knew it. The room fell quiet. Even the rustle of legal pads stopped. "Mr. Musk," Boasberg said, his voice rising, "you're here under subpoena. You do not lecture this court, and you certainly do not question my integrity." Musk didn't flinch. "Then don't make this personal, Judge." The heat in the room was palpable now. You could feel it. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was the kind that made your skin tighten. Judge Boasberg sat back, gripped his gavel, but didn't strike it. "You want to defend actions that violate my direct order, fine," he said coldly. "But don't pretend you have credibility left. Your track record with regulatory bodies speaks for itself." That line changed everything. Boasberg didn't shout it. He didn't slam his gavel. But he said it in front of the courtroom, in front of attorneys, journalists, and two tech CEOs sitting quietly in the third row. In that moment, the issue wasn't about data collection or AI ethics or even privacy. It was about pride, reputation, power. Musk stood there, eyes locked on Boasberg. Then, calmly, he reached into his briefcase. "I was hoping we wouldn't need this today," he said, "but I won't be accused of recklessness by someone who should be recusing himself from this case." He held up a sealed manila envelope. It had a blue sticker on the flap marked Internal Confidential Report. On the back was the signature of an agent from the Office of the Inspector General. Murmurs filled the courtroom. Boasberg's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" the judge asked. "It's a sworn affidavit," Musk answered. "And it doesn't come from me. It comes from one of your own." But before anyone could respond, the clerk stood up and announced a brief recess. Boasberg never asked for it. He just nodded once, stood up, and walked out the side door without a word. 15 minutes later, the courtroom reopened, but it felt like an entirely different place. Gone was the stiff order of legal proceedings. What remained was tension sharp as glass, and every single person in that room knew something had cracked. Boasberg hadn't returned yet. A senior clerk took his place for the time being, stating that the matter was under review. But no one was thinking about procedure anymore. Every glance, every whisper, every phone screen lit up in laps, all centered around the envelope Musk had dropped like a bomb. Outside in the hallway, Elon Musk stood next to his attorney Sarah Lton, a former federal prosecutor with a history of calling out judicial misconduct. She leaned in and whispered something only he could hear. But Musk barely moved. He kept watching the doors like he was waiting for something, or someone. "Back in 2022, Sarah said finally, her voice low but firm, "Boasberg tried to block Tesla from accessing government contracts tied to AI development. That was personal for Elon. He never forgot it." Elon Musk had spent over 20 years building technological empires, making his name by going where others wouldn't: space, electric vehicles, neural interfaces. But this case hit a different nerve, because for months he'd heard whispers about backdoor coordination between federal courts and tech competitors. And Boasberg's name kept popping up. Nothing direct, nothing provable, just enough to make you wonder who was really pulling the strings. The affidavit in his hand was a statement from a former court assistant named Michael Foster. 32 years old, methodical, kept his head down. Michael had worked inside Boasberg's chambers for 3 years, until 2 months ago. He vanished from the court roster without explanation. He had written, under oath, that Judge Boasberg maintained informal contact with a tech consortium called Digital Privacy Coalition. Not illegal by itself, but the group had submitted amicus briefs in this exact case, strongly urging the court to block Tesla's data collection practices. According to Michael, he had been asked to run redrafts of certain briefs, often before they were officially filed. That alone wasn't standard protocol. It wasn't even remotely appropriate. But the worst part? Some of those edits came before the coalition ever sent the documents to the court. That wasn't legal. That wasn't even gray area. That was tampering. If you've been following cases like this, cases that expose the inner workings of our institutions, you will want to subscribe now. Because we're just getting started with uncovering what happens behind these closed doors. Boasberg returned 20 minutes later. His robe still on, but his face was different now. Less cold. More rattled. Musk had already taken his seat again, Sarah beside him. She looked directly at the judge and didn't blink once. "We've received the contents of your submission," Boasberg announced stiffly. "And for the record, I categorically deny any impropriety." "No one accused you yet," Sarah replied coolly. "That's the problem." Gasps again. Musk leaned forward just slightly, elbows on the desk. "I'm requesting a formal hearing on judicial misconduct," Sarah continued. "And I'm requesting your immediate recusal until that hearing takes place." Boasberg didn't answer. He stared at her. He stared at Musk, then finally looked over to the court clerk, who had gone visibly pale. "Court will take a recess until further notice," he said abruptly and stood again. But this time 2 U.S. Marshals stood near the side exit. Not by accident, not for show. And for the first time all morning, Boasberg hesitated. But the minute he stepped off the bench, Musk's attorney handed a copy of the affidavit directly to the Marshals, and the doors closed behind them without another word. They say there's a line in every courtroom, an invisible one. You can argue, challenge, protest, but you don't cross that line. That morning Judge James Boasberg crossed it. What he said to Musk wasn't part of legal discourse. It wasn't judicial restraint or even controlled anger. It was something deeper, personal, calculated, and designed to cut. It happened just before the first recess, in the final seconds before the envelope was revealed. Most people missed it in the chaos, but the reporters sitting in the front row caught it. So did the court transcription software. And once the word got out, it spread like wildfire. "You've always been good at playing the visionary," Boasberg had said. "Too bad no one with real authority ever took you seriously." That line didn't come from a place of legal disagreement. That was a man trying to humiliate another man publicly in a federal courtroom, with cameras outside and reporters waiting. For Elon Musk, it wasn't just offensive. It was a threat to everything he stood for. He had been through congressional hearings, protests, public backlash. He'd been called names on live television. But that insult, delivered by a federal judge, was the first time he felt like the system was no longer pretending to be fair. It was just naked power, unmasked and unbothered. When the second session resumed that afternoon, Boasberg didn't sit behind the bench. A temporary magistrate named Judge Patricia Harris handled the docket. She was calm, neutral, and didn't show a trace of emotion. But the air had changed. Sarah stood first. She didn't wait for permission. "Before we begin, Your Honor, I'd like the court to hear the full reading of the affidavit, so the record is complete." Judge Harris glanced at the marshal standing near the witness box. "Proceed." As the marshal read Michael Foster's statement aloud, the gallery sat frozen. The claims were precise. Dates, document versions, file names, internal memos. Michael had even attached metadata showing when Boasberg had reviewed early draft briefs weeks before they were filed. The courtroom wasn't just listening. It was processing the scale of what had just been revealed. Musk's face was calm, but his fingers tapped a slow, steady rhythm against the table. When the reading ended, silence took over again. Then someone near the back stood up, an older man in a gray suit holding a press badge. He wasn't supposed to speak, but the moment took him. "If this is true, the judge tampered with case law before the trial even began." Harris didn't scold him. She simply said, "That's not for this room to decide." But the comment had already landed. Across the street inside the U.S. Attorney's office, investigators were already pulling case files from Boasberg's previous rulings, every case involving Digital Privacy Coalition, every brief he'd allowed, rejected, or cited in his opinions. Because now it wasn't about this one case. And back inside the courtroom, Harris finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Until further notice," she said, "Judge Boasberg will no longer preside over this matter. The Department of Justice has been notified. The court will cooperate fully with any investigation." No emotion, no elaboration, just the hammer dropping. Elon Musk didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just looked down at the table for a few seconds, then closed the folder in front of him. "You think this is about technology?" he whispered to Sarah, barely audible. "It's about rot. Deep, deep rot." But even as the gallery began to clear, someone else slipped out a side door with a burner phone already in hand. And within minutes, the entire thing hit social media word for word. By the time the affidavit reached Silicon Valley tech execs, Michael Foster's name was trending online, even though no one had ever seen his face. On a quiet street in Oakland, California, Michael sat alone in a rented apartment above a local coffee shop. The blinds were drawn. His phone was off. He hadn't spoken to his family in 3 weeks, not since the day he sent the documents to the office of the Inspector General with the words, "For urgent review," scrawled across the subject line. He never expected it to go this far. Michael wasn't a crusader. He wasn't looking for fame or a book deal. He just couldn't keep printing briefs from a coalition that kept showing up on Boasberg's private calendar when he was explicitly told not to question it. It started small, calendar entries labeled "Community Outreach." But Michael knew the names. One of them belonged to Alexandra Chin, lead legal strategist at Digital Privacy Coalition. Another belonged to Marcus Reed, a longtime tech investor and policy advisor known for pushing boundaries in the name of data privacy. Both had ties to cases Boasberg had ruled on. But the breaking point came during a lunch meeting Michael wasn't supposed to overhear. Boasberg had invited Reed into his chambers. Michael had just stepped out to grab a document when he heard it, clear as day. "Give me language that'll hold up under scrutiny, and I'll give it weight," Boasberg said. "Just keep it quiet." Michael froze. He didn't understand all of it, but he knew that kind of collaboration wasn't allowed. Not between judges and outside groups submitting briefs. Not when rulings affected billion-dollar companies and millions of users. He stayed quiet for weeks, but it ate at him. He wrote everything down, dates, times, meeting notes. He compiled screenshots from internal servers showing the edits, and tracked IP addresses of those who accessed the files. Most came from within Boasberg's office. A few came from Reed's personal firm. And when he left quietly, without notice, he mailed a hard copy to the DOJ, then disappeared. Now, watching the news feed scroll across the screen in front of him, Michael wasn't sure if he felt relief or fear. Back in San Francisco, the affidavit was already causing ripple effects. Legal watchdogs were calling for an audit of every ruling Boasberg had made in the past decade. A subcommittee in Congress announced an emergency hearing to review ethics standards in federal courts. Meanwhile, Elon Musk was pulled into a side meeting with two federal agents from the Inspector General's office. They weren't there for a press moment. They wanted names, timelines, and details only someone inside the system could provide. "They'll try to bury this," one of the agents said flatly. "The judiciary protects its own." "Not this time," Musk replied. "Not when they thought they were above the law." The weight of what was happening hadn't fully hit yet. It wasn't just a tech scandal. It was a breach of trust in the one place where people expected to find fairness. Judge Patricia Harris released a formal court order later that evening. Boasberg would remain suspended pending review. All of his active cases were reassigned. The affidavit, now verified, was sealed by federal investigators as part of a growing probe. The media had only just begun circling. Every network anchor, every podcast host, every political blog, left and right, had a take. But beneath the noise, one quiet truth had settled in the minds of millions watching. Something real had just cracked open. And it started with a court clerk no one had ever heard of, carrying a secret he never wanted to hold. But just as the DOJ began preparing formal inquiries, a second whistleblower came forward, someone who claimed Boasberg's behavior went even further than anyone realized. It was just past 5:30 p.m. when the courtroom emptied for the day. The air outside had cooled, but inside the federal building, things were only getting hotter. Judge Boasberg's chambers were now considered a restricted area. 2 U.S. Marshals had been stationed outside his office door. No one was going in or out without clearance. The judge hadn't been arrested, not yet, but that didn't mean he was free. Inside an adjoining conference room, Boasberg sat across from 2 deputy marshals and a DOJ ethics investigator named Monica Wright. She wasn't there to be polite. Her questions cut like wire. "Did you ever receive preliminary copies of amicus briefs from Digital Privacy Coalition before they were publicly filed?" Boasberg didn't answer immediately. His fingers tapped the armrest once, twice. "I can't recall the sequence," he finally said. "That's not an answer," Wright replied. "Either you did or you didn't." Boasberg looked down. His throat moved as he swallowed. "They were drafts. Nothing final. And it wasn't like that." "Like what?" she pressed. "They weren't influencing rulings. They were context." Wright leaned back in her chair. "You edited arguments submitted by a group directly benefiting from your rulings. That's not context, Judge. That's conspiracy." Outside the room, Elon Musk paced the corridor with Sarah by his side. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say. The system they both thought they understood had just turned itself inside out. A federal agent walked by and gave Musk a tight nod. This one meant something. They were moving. By 6:45 p.m., Boasberg's office had been entered under a sealed search order. Investigators took 2 hard drives, a stack of personal notebooks, and 1 unregistered external USB that wasn't on any government inventory list. That drive would become the center of a separate investigation later, one with even darker implications. For now, though, the focus was on what they already had: Michael's affidavit, the metadata logs, meeting records, and now a second whistleblower. This one from Digital Privacy Coalition, who had quietly turned over 8 months of internal emails showing coordinated messaging strategies shared directly with Boasberg's law clerk. Meanwhile, the courthouse was swarmed with media vans, boom mics, and flashbulbs. Protesters had started showing up too, not the usual activists. These were people angry about corruption, betrayal, and the idea that justice was now something you had to dig for instead of expect. Inside the federal holding office, Boasberg was still not officially charged, but his options were shrinking by the hour. Back in the main lobby, Musk stood alone by the large glass windows. Reporters tried to shout questions through the barricade, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the building across the street, where the DOJ had set up a temporary review team. Sarah walked up beside him and handed over a copy of the official notice just released to the press. Judge Boasberg placed on administrative leave pending federal investigation. It read, DOJ confirms cooperation with Office of the Inspector General and U.S. Marshal Service. Allegations of misconduct deemed credible. Musk took the paper, folded it once, and tucked it into his coat. You think this is justice? Sarah asked. No, Musk said without looking at her. It's just the beginning. But as the news made its way to Washington overnight, a quiet storm began building, because Boasberg wasn't the only judge those coalition briefs had reached. By sunrise the next morning, Washington, D.C. wasn't waking up. It was already in motion. The halls of the Capitol buzzed with private calls, emergency briefings, and hushed conversations behind locked doors. A handful of lawmakers had been up all night, not because they were directly tied to the case, but because they'd long suspected something like this might eventually surface. The scandal surrounding Judge Boasberg was no longer confined to one courtroom. It had opened a crack in the federal system that no one could ignore. In the Senate Judiciary Committee's chambers, Chairman Robert Blackwell reviewed the affidavit with a look that said it all. This wasn't just bad optics. This was exposure, dangerous exposure. There's at least 4 judges flagged in this batch of filings, Blackwell told his staff. 2 in California, 1 in New York, 1 in Virginia, all referenced in the same communication chains from Digital Privacy Coalition. The emails pulled by federal investigators overnight showed recurring patterns, suggestions for legal phrasing, document exchange before filing deadlines, and permeating calendar events marked with vague terms like strategic alignment and policy coordination. That alone didn't prove corruption. But when paired with Michael's testimony and now the second whistleblower from inside the coalition, people started asking the right questions. Who else knew? Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, Elon Musk was on a secure line with the House Oversight Committee. The conversation was measured, but there was an edge to it. This doesn't stop with Boasberg, Musk said. If they were passing around legal strategy like a group chat, you better believe it reached further than this building. The House office promised a hearing, not just to address Boasberg's case, but to re-examine the way amicus briefs are handled altogether. For decades, third-party groups had used them to influence policy under the guise of legal perspective. Now, those quiet little documents were under a microscope. Back in D.C., political factions took their predictable sides. Some defended Boasberg, calling the investigation a tech titan's vendetta meant to derail privacy protections. Others leaned into it hard, saying it was about time judicial activism was exposed for what it really was, a power play masked as consumer protection. But in homes across the country, in Seattle, in Austin, in Boston, regular people weren't arguing legal theories. They were asking something simpler. Can you trust the judge sitting at the front of the room? Networks ran loops of Musk's confrontation with Boasberg, slowed down and captioned. His, "Then don't make this personal, Judge," had already become a meme, but not because it was funny. Because it felt raw, honest, familiar. Americans had long suspected that fairness in the system was uneven. But now they had something concrete. Someone with status, robes, and federal protection had taken sides before the gavel ever hit the wood. For those who value transparency and accountability in our institutions, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We'll be following this story and others like it, bringing you the details others might miss. Inside the Department of Justice, Monica Wright was already expanding the scope of her investigation. They were forming a task force quietly, with no press release. They didn't need another headline. They needed evidence. Back at Oakland, Michael Foster watched the coverage from his apartment, still hidden from view. His name had leaked, but his location hadn't. He saw his own scanned affidavit appear on the screen, highlighted line by line. He muted the television and turned off the lamp. Then he sat in silence. In some corner of his mind, he thought maybe he'd feel better by now, but all he felt was tired. Meanwhile, Sarah Ton was already preparing her next move. Musk's name had been floated for testimony in front of Congress. She was pushing for it, not because it would boost his profile, but because the public deserved to hear what he saw behind those closed doors. The way decisions were framed before cases were even heard. The silent pressure. The favors disguised as outreach. This wasn't over. If anything, the hard part was just beginning. But before anyone could catch their breath, an internal memo leaked from the DOJ. And it suggested the next judge under scrutiny might already be preparing to resign. The memo hit inboxes just after 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. It wasn't meant for public eyes, but someone inside the DOJ had had enough. It was short, just 5 paragraphs, and it named a third federal judge under quiet investigation. This one was based out of Boston, with a similar pattern of interactions involving digital privacy, coalition, and early drafts of advocacy briefs. And just like that, it was no longer a Boasberg story. It was a systemic story. Cable news picked it up within the hour. Headlines shifted from scandal to suspicion. Political analysts started referring to it as Judicial Gate, though most people didn't need a label to understand what was happening. This wasn't about left or right. It was about people who were supposed to be impartial, choosing sides in silence. In San Francisco, Elon Musk stood outside the courthouse with Sarah by his side, speaking to a growing group of reporters. His face wasn't angry. It was tired, but resolute. "I don't care what side of the tech privacy debate you're on," he said, his voice steady. "But when judges start taking advice from advocacy groups before the hearing even starts, that's not justice. That's choreography." He paused, then continued. "We built companies on the idea that you walk into a courtroom and have a fair shot, no matter who you are. What happened here? That's not just a legal failure. That's a betrayal." The crowd listened. Some nodded. Some just stood still, digesting what they were hearing. Musk didn't want fame from this. He never did. He wanted to walk into courtrooms where the fight was fair, even if it was hard. He believed in innovation and progress. Not when it served him, but when it stood on its own, even when it was inconvenient. Behind him, reporters yelled out questions. Would there be indictments? Was Boasberg going to jail? What did the DOJ know, and when? Musk didn't answer. "You think anything changes after this?" he asked, quieter now. "Depends on whether people are actually paying attention," she said. Later that evening, a roundup was aired on national television. Judges, legal scholars, and former clerks debated the meaning of what had just unfolded. Most agreed it was a wake-up call. Others said it was just the beginning. But across the country, in living rooms, break rooms, and kitchen tables, Americans were having a different kind of conversation. One that didn't need legal degrees. They were talking about trust. Because if you can't trust the courtroom, what's left? In Oakland, Michael finally turned his phone back on. Dozens of missed messages. Some from reporters, one from a brother he hadn't heard from in years, 3 from a blocked number. He didn't answer any of them. Instead, he sat down and opened a blank document on his laptop. He didn't know what he was going to write yet. Maybe a letter. Maybe a record. But something inside him said the truth still had more to say. In D.C., the Judiciary Committee voted to open a formal inquiry into amicus brief practices across federal courts. Quietly, more whistleblowers began to come forward. Not all had smoking guns, but their stories matched the pattern. The cracks were real. This story started with a confrontation, a tense back and forth between a tech visionary and a federal judge standing in front of a bench. But it ended with a question that every American had to answer for themselves. What happens when the people who promise us justice stop playing by the rules? Because justice isn't a robe, or a bench, or a gavel. It's a choice. Every day, every case, every voice. And the moment we stop expecting honesty from those who hold the most power, we give that power permission to serve itself. If you've made it this far, ask yourself what fairness really means. And if you believe in accountability, no matter who's in the spotlight, then subscribe. Because we're just getting started.